All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Middle East and Africa panel. I think it's appropriate that we eat while we do the Middle East. That's usually how things go. We have four excellent papers, and actually, thinking about the Reagan years in the 80s, it's a very unusual decade, very interesting decade, a decade that really opens the present for us in a ways in which the 70s, 60s, the 50s don't. There is much work to do on that, and it's also a decade, as we will see, that becomes extremely complex, where state actors begin to have a lesser role and non-state actors step up their game. We are having four presenters. I'll present them one at a time. The first speaker is Seth Anziska from University College of London. Seth got his PhD in 2015 from Columbia University, where he worked with Rashid Khalidi, and he's specializing in everything that passes between Palestinians and Israelis in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, specifically the 80s. And he is going to speak about the limits of triumphalism in the Middle East, Israel, the Palestinian question, and Lebanon in the age of Reagan.
Thank you, Yoav. And I want to thank the organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference. I've learned a great deal from you all, and I'm struck by how far scholarship on the 1980s has advanced since I started graduate school over a decade ago. At the time, everybody used to sort of ask me, how could I work on this period? Were there even archives available? And I tried to explain that there were these vast, untapped oceans of primary sources, and they sort of were doubtful and skeptical. I think this gathering makes it very clear that we're only touching the tip of the iceberg. I've also been struck by the persistence of a divide that is central to the international history of this era, not structure versus agency or the degree of Reagan's credit in ending the Cold War, but the role of the United States in the world, and the world as seen from Washington compared to the experience of Washington across the global South. In short, what happens when we look beyond the triumphalist stories of Europe and turn our attention to the periphery? As the first paper on a panel about the Middle East and Africa, I sense I may not be alone in having a rather different view of Reagan and the transformation of global politics. Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, I want to suggest, throw a great big wrench into the story. Reagan's tenure, I argue, led to the erosion of a just and equitable outcome to Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, and the subsequent overreach in Lebanon underscored the limits of military intervention as a tool of foreign policy. Stephen Hayward suggested yesterday that Reagan had little interest in the Middle East, seeing it as a sideshow to East-West relations. But I would argue that it was actually central to global Cold War concerns, and we cannot understand Reagan if we fail to look at the periphery. So, how did Reagan see the Middle East? In his memoir, the recently retired president wrote, quote, "Although we had moments of progress, and at times we managed to bottle up, at least temporarily, the savagery that forever lies beneath the sands of the Middle East, the region was still an adder's nest of problems when I moved out of the White House 8 years later, and along the way it had been the source of some of my administration's most difficult moments." Amidst this savagery, Reagan's abiding regional affinity was Israel. His memoirs reflect this. I've believed in many things in my life, he wrote, but no conviction I've ever held has been stronger than my belief that the United States must ensure the survival of Israel. During an early campaign meeting about the Middle East, one participant remembers the candidate speaking fondly about Exodus, the wildly popular Otto Preminger film based on the influential novel by Leon Uris and starring Paul Newman that celebrated the miraculous victory of Israel over the Arabs in 1948. On September 3rd, 1980, he addressed a Jewish American group at the B'nai B'rith Forum in Washington, D.C. While we have since 1948 clung to the argument of a moral imperative to explain our commitment to Israel, Reagan argued, no administration has ever deluded itself that Israel was not of permanent strategic importance to America, until, that is, the Carter administration, which has violated this covenant with the past. In his extensive repudiation of Carter-era policy, Reagan criticized American arms sales to Saudi Arabia and Jordan. He upheld the indivisibility of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and his approach was reflected in the pages of the staunchly pro-Israel Commentary magazine, which characterized Carter's hands-on approach to resolving Israel's conflict with the Arab world as appeasement. In Reagan's view, Israel was clearly seen as part of an anti-communist struggle that would keep Soviet influence in the Middle East at bay. Without this bastion of liberal democracy in the heart of the area, Reagan wrote in the Washington Post in 1979, our own position would be weaker. After taking office, this view was emphasized by leading neoconservative advisors who promoted, quote, the idea that Israel was a vital Cold War ally of the United States and that Palestinians were tools of the Soviet Union in its campaign of international terrorism. Reagan's closest advisors often disagreed on questions related to the Middle East, with Secretary of State Alexander Haig voicing consistent support for Israel, while Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger pushed for engagement with moderate Arabs. Both career officers in the State Department and the NSC have emphasized how the divided approach of the administration was a serious impediment to decision-making early on in Reagan's tenure. Nicholas Veliotis, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, remarked critically that, quote, there was a determination to globalize everything in the Middle East at the expense of regional realities. This globalist outlook was on full display during Alexander Haig's first trip to Egypt and Israel as Secretary of State in April 1981. During his opening meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Haig characterized Syrian aggression in Lebanon, which was the direct outgrowth of local tensions in a long-time simmering civil war, as part of a broader Soviet struggle for increased influence in the region. This worldview shaped discussions over the Palestinians as well. Haig sympathized with Israel's deep opposition to a Palestinian state. It would be a mortal danger to us, Begin implored. It would be a Soviet base in the Middle East after all the Soviets achieved: Mozambique, South Yemen, Ethiopia, invading Afghanistan. Unavoidably, the Judea, Samaria, and Gaza district and those settlements would be taken over by the PLO, and the PLO is a real satellite of the Soviet Union. The inclusion of the PLO into the Soviet orbit solidified a pattern of Palestinian state prevention that was a primary focus of Begin since his 1977 election as prime minister. Growing mutual interest between the US and Israel was encapsulated by Haig's efforts to initiate a strategic dialogue beyond military channels. Meetings throughout the summer and fall of 1981 culminated in the formalization of the first strategic alliance between the two countries. Ahead of its signing, Defense Minister Ariel Sharon outlined an expansive vision of Israel's Cold War strategic value to President Reagan. Israel can do things, Mr. President, that other countries cannot do. We have the stability of a real democracy. We are on the Mediterranean. Israel is a country positioned from which we can both act in the Mediterranean theater and in Africa. One American participant recalls seeing Secretary Weinberger, quote, blanch visibly at Sharon's presentation, which outlined Israeli military assistance as far east as Iran and as far north as Turkey. Weinberger was wary of any sign that the U.S. was turning away from key Arab states, particularly the Gulf countries. Everyone on the American side, one American observer, U.S. Ambassador Israel Sam Lewis, observed, was shocked by the grandiose scope of the Sharon concept for strategic cooperation. In forging this alliance, the administration turned a blind eye to the more troubling aspects of the Israeli government's agenda, such as settlement expansion, and put aside strident arguments over the bombing of Iraq's nuclear reactor, which Ori and Giordana have outlined in their detailed paper, as well as Israel's decision to extend Israeli law to the Golan Heights. Despite the very real tensions that resulted from these disagreements, Israel emerged in the Reagan era with a new strategic rationale to entrench its global Cold War standing, solidify its regional position in the Middle East, and maintain its internal hold over the occupied territories. This strategic alliance with Israel, I want to suggest, served to facilitate three crucial developments. First, it denied the Palestinians substantive political standing. Second, it enabled settlement expansion in the occupied territories. And lastly, it abetted the invasion of Lebanon. I will briefly touch on these three developments in the remainder of my talk. First, on the Palestinians. During the November 1980 campaign, when asked whether he thought the PLO was a terrorist organization, Reagan answered affirmatively while also making an important distinction. Quote, I separate the PLO from the Palestinian refugees. None ever elected the PLO. His views were connected to broader antipathy towards the violence of anti-colonial movements in the 1960s and 1970s. Quote, "We live in a world in which any band of thugs clever enough to get the word liberation into its name can thereupon murder school children and have its deeds considered glamorous and glorious," Reagan said during the campaign. Yet, as the leading experts on Palestinian political history have demonstrated, the PLO had shifted to a diplomatic track by the late 1970s. This distinction was often blurred inside Reagan's White House. Richard Allen, Reagan's first national security advisor, dismissed moderating influences within the PLO, telling an interviewer for the news program 2020, "I've heard descriptions that identified Arafat as a moderate, but we're certainly wanting in hard proof that this is the case. One man's moderate is another man's terrorist." Area experts, however, understood that the PLO was a complex organization undergoing an internal transformation. Raymond Tanter, an NSC staffer focusing on the Middle East, wrote to Allen in November that the president should not brand all the PLO organizations as terrorists, since the PLO includes a number of social and political institutions. There is also now ample evidence of direct low-level contact between Reagan officials and moderate members of the PLO, leading directly to an evolution of US policy toward the Palestinians and the administration's recognition of the organization after the outbreak of the First Intifada in 1987. Nevertheless, Palestinian factions in Beirut took note of the hostility towards the PLO in Washington, which is reflected in the active Arabic press of the time. One leading weekly, Al-Hadaf, the Target, was unrelenting in its critique of what it characterized as American neo-imperial aspirations in the Middle East. Reagan was seen as restoring the use of force as a primary tool of American foreign policy and a radical departure from Carter and the US human rights agenda. So from the perspective of Palestinian activists in the global South, Reagan offered little hope for reversing their condition of statelessness. The brunt of Al-Hadaf's fury was directed at Israel and Prime Minister Begin, in particular, around the settlement policy. The linkage between Begin's settlement expansion and the Reagan administration was underscored by changing US position towards the legality of ongoing building projects in the West Bank, the second outgrowth of Reagan's strategic alliance with Israel. Throughout Carter's presidency, US policy on the settlements was clear and consistent. They were considered illegal under international law and detrimental to the peace process, and the administration opposed both new settlements and expansion of those already built. During the 1980 campaign, Reagan took a very different stance. In an interview with Time magazine, the California governor was asked whether he would try to persuade Israel to stop settling the West Bank. "Frankly, I don't know the answer to that," Reagan replied. "Under UN Resolution 242, the West Bank was supposed to be open to all, and then Jordan and Israel would work out an agreement for the area. In light of these terms," Reagan argued, "I do not see how it is illegal for Israel to move in settlements." This would be expanded during the first week after the inauguration, where again Reagan reiterated, "I disagreed with the previous administration when referred to settlements as illegal. They're not illegal." Eugene Rostow, who's been mentioned earlier, the Sterling Professor of Law at Yale and the older brother of Walt Rostow, was an influential voice in facilitating the semantic and legal shift. Rostow's adamant defense of the settlements served to entrench a viewpoint that the territories were never occupied, contradicting Israeli jurists as far back as 1967. You can actually trace this view directly to the stance of David Friedman, who's President Trump's nominee for ambassador to Israel. The consequence of embracing such a shift towards settlements was borne out in practical terms by the rapid pace of Israeli expansion throughout the 1980s. 5,000 Jewish settlers lived in the West Bank when Begin entered office in 1977, and over 80,000 by the late 80s. In the interim, commuter towns and bypass roads for settlers bisected the actual ground upon which Palestinian sovereignty could be achieved, as a matrix of Israeli control was consolidated that by some accounts would prove and has proved irreversible. Reagan himself was personally aware of the consequences of this expansion. In his diary on February 14, 1983, he wrote, "Valentine's Day, had a brief on the West Bank. There can be no question but that Israel has a well-thought-out plan to take over the West Bank." In his memoirs, he later wrote that settlements were, quote, "a continued violation of UN Security Council Resolution 242. Yet despite this rhetoric, his administration played a crucial role in enabling their expansion. The third and final outgrowth of the US alliance with Israel that I want to touch on is the 1982 Lebanon War. Newly available evidence demonstrates that the alignment between the Begin government and the Reagan administration helped foment Israel's invasion, sowing regional upheaval and drawing the United States into what at the time was the largest quagmire since the Vietnam War. It was a war that embroiled the administration and viscerally affected President Reagan himself. And I won't go into the background. I explain in more detail in the paper what drove the Israeli invasion and sort of the decision to target Palestinian nationalism. But I want to say that the Reagan administration was well informed of Israel's aims. Defense Minister Ariel Sharon first revealed the extent of the war plans to the Americans during a meeting with Reagan's special envoy to Lebanon, Ambassador Philip Habib, in December '81. Habib reportedly asked Sharon what Israel would do with the thousands of Palestinians in the country, and Sharon allegedly replied, quote, "We'll hand them over to the Lebanese. In any case, we expect to be in Lebanon only for a few days. The Lebanese Christians will take care of them." Sharon did not need to do much convincing to garner U.S. support for military action. A few days before the invasion, he came to Washington and explained in detail to Haig what he was planning. The notebooks of Charles Hill, a top State Department aide, clearly indicate, contrary to a lot of the dominant narratives that exist now, that an American green light was given for Israel's actions. And to read from those notebooks, Haig told Sharon that an invasion required, quote, "a recognizable provocation similar to the Falklands." Quote, "Hope you'll be sensitive to the need for provocation to be understood internationally," Haig said. Sharon replied that he was aware of your concern about size. "Our intent is not a large operation. Try to be as small and efficient as possible." "Like a lobotomy," Haig replied approvingly. Below this, Hill wrote the following: "A green light from Haig on limited operation." In the days immediately following the invasion, U.S. officials debated the extent to which the administration should endorse Israel's lobotomy. Haig and UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick felt Israel should be left to destroy the PLO, which they saw as a proxy of the Soviet Union. The more cautious trio of Weinberger, White House Chief of Staff James Baker, and NSC advisor William Clark favored holding Israel to a more limited operation. Given his administration's overarching anti-Soviet agenda, Reagan believed the U.S. could simultaneously manage its long-standing friendship with Israel and its important allies with wealthy anti-communist Arab states. The ensuing Israeli overreach in Lebanon and American complicity in the war swiftly disabused him and his administration of this notion. As I've detailed in the paper, tensions rose throughout the fighting during the summer of '82. On August 25th, 800 U.S. Marines began to arrive in Beirut, equipped for a non-combat role to help with the withdrawal of PLO leader Yasser Arafat and his men from Lebanon. The administration also guaranteed the protection of Palestinian civilians remaining behind in side letters that Habib gave to PLO leader Arafat during the arduous negotiations. These letters were blatantly ignored, with calamitous results in the days that followed. And I'll just preface it by saying that Reagan himself announced a peace plan on September 1st from the Western White House in California. This was upended by the September 14th assassination of Bashir Gemayel, and there was a security vacuum that resulted because of the withdrawal of U.S. Marines to their ships. And as a result of the vacuum and of Israeli actions in West Beirut, Lebanese Christian militias were free to terrorize Palestinian civilians who remained behind. Between the evening of September 16th and the afternoon of September 18th, Phalange fighters launched a cold-blooded attack on defenseless Palestinian civilians in the Israeli-controlled Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, killing at least 800 people. The U.S. government was unwittingly complicit in this three-day massacre, a deeply troubling story that I've written about in great detail in the paper. While America's role in Sabra and Shatila was a moral stain, it was also a strategic disaster. It undercut U.S. influence in the region and precipitated further military involvement in the Lebanese Civil War. On October 23, 1983, in the single deadliest attack against the U.S. Marine Corps since World War II, an enormous explosion ripped through the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American servicemen. Minutes later, a second suicide bomber hit the French military barracks in the Drakkar building, killing 58 paratroopers in France's single worst military loss since the Algerian War. These attacks led to open warfare with Syrian-backed forces, and soon after, the rapid withdrawal of the Marines and multinational forces to their ships, accelerating the end of U.S. and European involvement in Lebanon. Despite Reagan's pledge to retaliate against the perpetrators and not withdraw until the mission was complete, U.S. troops departed within months. In the words of U.S. Ambassador Sam Lewis, America left the country, quote, with our tail between our legs. Lebanon facilitated Syria's regional ascendancy and served as an incubator of other important regional transformations, in particular, the growing influence of Iran and the rise of Hezbollah. By way of concluding, let me reiterate, as I do in the paper, that Reagan's open clashes with Israel, as well as the gradual recognition that Palestinian nationalism was not going to be defeated militarily, gradually yielded a return to the comprehensive peace principles of Camp David and a belated reckoning with the very questions Reagan had sidestepped or dismissed when entering office. Yet, the marked shift from Jimmy Carter's approach and the formalizing of a strategic alliance with Begin's government served to link U.S. foreign policy with the most reactionary elements of Israel's right-wing Likud party. Reagan emboldened advocates for settlement building in the territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. His administration marginalized Palestinian nationalists as proxies of the Soviet Union, fueling the green light offered by Haig for Israel's invasion of Lebanon. The cumulative impact of these policies was to undercut the basis of a contiguous Palestinian political entity while solidifying a troubling pattern of U.S.-Israeli relations. When viewed alongside the Lebanon War and other regional interventions which Doug and Brian will discuss, U.S. policy in the Middle East actually served, I think, to foment and exacerbate regional violence. This violence, the adder's nests of problems, in Reagan's words, did not just come from nowhere. It was produced through direct American intervention, from military support for Israeli actions, the marginalization of the Palestinians, and a changing legal regime in dealing with settlements. As we are likely poised for a new set of policies that threaten to foment and exacerbate upheaval in Israel-Palestine, it is worth revisiting the events of the 1980s to assess the shadow they have cast ever since. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Seth. Our next speaker is Flavia Gaspari, who is a teaching fellow at King's College in London. And she specializes in war and international politics in Africa. Her talk today is titled The Reagan Administration and the Cold War, Endgame in the Periphery, the Case of Southern Africa.
Thank you very much. So my presentation deals with the Reagan administration and the end of the Cold War in one of those regional battlefields, regional scenarios of the Cold War, Southern Africa. The presentation will focus on two main themes. First of all, of course, the role of the Reagan administration's policy in ending the Cold War in Southern Africa, and then the legacy left by this policy for the following Bush administration. And then we'll try also to draw some general conclusion on the broader themes of the Cold War in the Third World. So, Southern Africa. The conflict in Southern Africa started in the 70s with the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in the region. At the time, South Africa was a quite good ally of the United States, despite the apartheid regime, and despite the fact that South Africa was illegally occupying Namibia, establishing a de facto colony in Namibia. With the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, all the countries surrounding South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and later Zimbabwe, established, first of all, black majority rule, which of course made them extremely hostile against the apartheid in South Africa. And then they also established Marxist-inspired regimes, which of course raised the concerns of the United States in the region. Also, the civil war which broke out in Angola immediately after the independence between the MPLA and UNITA rapidly became a kind of proxy war between the two blocs, with UNITA supported by the United States with covert operation, and by South Africa with military invasions on the border with Namibia. And MPLA supported by the Soviet Union and, even more important, by Cuba, which deployed thousands of troops in Angola, raising the concerns of the United States and of the strong anti-communist apartheid regime in South Africa. So, as you may see from these events, the 70s marked an earthquake in the political equilibrium of Southern Africa. Also, it marked the full extension of the Cold War in Southern Africa, the intervention of the two blocs in the regional and local conflicts in Southern Africa, and created a sort of overlap between the global Cold War paradigm and the local and regional dynamics of Southern Africa. And this overlap had a very important consequence, because it connected this regional war to the global Cold War dynamics in a sort of mutually influencing core-periphery interaction. What does it mean? It means that, on the one hand, the intervention of the external actors in the conflicts in Southern Africa created an internationalization of these conflicts, which in some cases were just internal affairs, like the struggle for powers between MPLA and Angola. On the other hand, the conflict in Southern Africa became one of those regional conflicts, one of those conflicts in the Third World, which eventually damaged, together with the Ogaden War in the Horn of Africa and the situation in Afghanistan in '79, they eventually damaged the process of détente which was going on at the time, particularly negotiation on arms control and the ratification of the SALT II agreement, which eventually collapsed in '79. So the disagreement between the two superpowers in the peripheral battlefields of the Cold War eventually damaged their relationship and their negotiations on the core issue of the Cold War, which was, of course, arms control. And Southern Africa became part of this process, of this core periphery interaction. So this was the situation when in the 80s, the Reagan administration entered the White House, and this gentleman, Chester Croker, became Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Chester Croker was, he served for both the terms of the Reagan administration. He was very influential. He devoted a lot of attention to the conflicts in Southern Africa because he understood, first of all, the role and the place of this conflict within the global Cold War. And then he was also able to understand all those connections and linkages between the local, regional, and global dynamics which had marked the development of the conflicts in Southern Africa during the 70s. And he developed a very complex and sophisticated strategy to address diplomatically this conflict. And under the umbrella of this strategy, he was able, since 1981, to establish contacts with both the South Africans and the Angolans to explore the possibility of solving this conflict militarily and also to remove the Cuban troops from Angola, which was, of course, the main American concern. Unfortunately, at the beginning, his action wasn't very easy because we are in the first half of the 80s, first Reagan administration, so the resumption of the Cold War tensions again, the proclamation of the Reagan Doctrine for the Third World. All these elements didn't make the job of Chester Croker very easy. And indeed, by the mid of the 80s, the negotiations, particularly with Angolans, reached a deadlock. However, 1985 was also a year which marked a very important turning point, because was, of course, the year of the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Reagan-Gorbachev dialogue. Now, we have heard a lot about this dialogue over the last few days. An aspect that I think we have not yet been fully discussed, and generally speaking, an aspect which is less considered, is the attention that the two superpowers devoted precisely to the Cold War in the Third World. There was a clear awareness within the Reagan administration that this time, besides the negotiation on the core problem of arms control and disarmament, which eventually led to the signature of the INF in 1987, this time it was crucial to also pay attention to all the conflict in the peripheries, to all the proxy wars in the periphery, precisely to avoid what had happened during the détente. And indeed, every single document in the Reagan Library concerning the meeting between the Soviets and the Americans on the regional conflicts make this reference to the shadow of the failure of the détente, to the détente syndrome, if you want. These conflicts were responsible for shattering the relations in the 70s, for sealing the fate of SALT II. What was wrong with the détente policy can be traced in the inadequate attention to the regional element of our relationship. So this time, it's crucial to pay attention to this regional element, because the Cold War is global, and détente must be global too. So, and from the document, this emerged very clearly, this aspect, this constant reference to the role of the regional conflicts in damaging the détente, and to the fact that this time things should work the other way around, because solving the superpowers' disagreements in the periphery can facilitate their dialogue on the main problem of the core issue of arms control. So this time, the core periphery interactions should be addressed with a different approach. Of course, within this context, the conflict in Southern Africa was one of those conflicts which was immediately identified as a problem to solve. And this was a boost for Chester Croker's diplomacy. Indeed, in the second half of the 80s, the negotiations brokered by Croker resumed. And this was coeval also with with some important military development of the war on the ground. Particularly between 87 and 88, there was a big clash in the south part of the Angola, close to the Namibian border, which raised the fear of a possible full-scale war between Cuba and South Africa, which on the one hand was of course very scary because it could have had severe consequences for this global relaxation of tensions. On the other hand, this clash also showed that the conflicts in Southern Africa had reached its culmination point. It was at the end of the 80s, either going on full-scale war that nobody wanted, or finally finding a negotiated solution. So all these elements together, the US dialogue, the Croker's diplomacy, and the military situation on the ground eventually caused a breakthrough of the negotiations and led in December 1988 to the signature of the New York Agreement between South Africa, Cuba, and Angola with the United States as broker. The signature of the New York Agreements in December 1988. What was it established in this agreement? First of all, the withdrawal of all the foreigner troops from Angola. The Cubans, first of all, was massive, and the South Africans. And of course, also the end of the support from the part of the superpowers to the parties of the civil war in Angola. Also, it established the independence of Namibia. So these arrangements eventually broke all those connections and linkages between the local, regional, and global dynamics which had characterized this conflict, and eventually in 1988 it removed the Cold War paradigm from the region. The split of the overlap between the two, between the global Cold War paradigm and the regional dynamics happened in 1988 with the New York Agreements. So what happened after 1988 with the arrival of a new administration in the United States? The Bush administration maintained a very strong line of continuity with the Reagan administration. He maintained the dialogue with Gorbachev, and it maintained, as far as the policy in the Third War was concerned, he maintained the same core periphery approach. Bush, as Reagan did, still saw cooperation with the Soviet Union in the regional conflicts as a way to support and to facilitate the broader relationship with Moscow. And this was evident, once again, in Southern Africa, where the United States was very involved in the Angolan peace process, which was still going on. And the Bush administration developed, together with the Soviet counterparts, a joint sponsorship between 1989 and 1991 for the Angolan peace process. And under this joint supervision, the two parties of the civil war, UNITA and MPLA, eventually signed in May 1991 the Bichesse Agreement. Unfortunately, the Bichesse Agreement didn't provide Angola with long-lasting peace. The conflict in Angola lasted until 2002, so the Bichesse Agreement wasn't a success in itself. It was instead a great success for the broader goal of the US involvement in Angolan peace process in Southern Africa, which was, of course, cooperation with the Soviet Union. And this is evident in the words that Secretary of State James Baker wrote to his Soviet counterpart immediately after the agreement. Our coordination in Angola is another indication of the positive spirit of cooperation that marks US-Soviet relations. We were able to work together to resolve a conflict that once divided us. So, to conclude, on the 2 points that I mentioned at the beginning, the role of the Reagan administration policy in ending the Cold War in Southern Africa can be identified in 2 main aspects. First of all, Chester Croker's diplomacy, which was one of the most important elements for the signature of the New York Agreement in 1988. Secondly, the new attention that the Reagan administration devoted to the regional element of its relationship with the Soviet Union. This aspect was, on the one hand, a turning point because it created a new framework, the framework of cooperation with the Soviet Union in which the conflicts in Southern Africa could be inserted. On the other hand, we can also see some similarities with the 70s, because this new framework was built on the ashes of the détente, on the main lesson learned from the détente, namely that there is a strong interplay between negotiation on arms control and superpowers policies in the Third World. So this new framework was built on that same core-periphery interaction which had characterized détente, with a crucial difference. While during the 70s the two tracks of the core-periphery interaction were divergent, during the 80s they became convergent, and this very convergence facilitates the resolution of the conflicts in Southern Africa with the New York agreements in 1988. I want to stress a point here, 1988, 1 year before the fall of the Berlin Wall, because it's not true that the narrative of the end of the Cold War that we apply to Europe, 1999, fall of the Berlin Wall, revolution in Eastern Europe, necessarily apply to all the battlefields of the Cold War. Maybe we can see many ends of the Cold War. For Southern Africa, I can say that the end was 1988. The wall fell in 1988. Even after this date, and I briefly move to the last point, we can see how the core-periphery interactions survived. The Bush administration was very involved in the peace process in Angola because this was functional to its broader relationship with Moscow. And this is evident from the fact that after the failure of the Bucharest Agreement in 1991, the task of resuming the negotiations between the parties was given to the United Nations, with just a very small profile of the United States. After all, after 1991, the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore, so the United States had lost an important point of reference for its policy in Southern Africa, as the Soviet Union had been, firstly in terms of cooperation, of confrontation during the 70s, and then in terms of cooperation during the 80s with the Reagan administration. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Flavia. Our next speaker is Brian Gibson of Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of 2 books on Iraq, Iran, the Kurds, and the U.S. That's a specialization of him. And today he's going to talk about Reagan administration, about Reagan and the Iran-Iraq war.
A little bit of...
15 minutes? You need more time?
Yeah, I need about a minute. There it is. Sorry, 1 second further. There we go. Where do I go to? There it is. Okay, so I want to thank John and Simon for organizing this great conference. But in addition to that, to the Clements Center for hosting us and bringing us all into this amazing conference that I have certainly learned a ton from. And when I originally proposed the topic for this lecture, or this presentation, I was like, I wrote a book on the Iran-Iraq war, and I edited another one. I shouldn't have any problems condensing all that knowledge down into 6,000 words. I bit off much more than I could chew, and decided that I was going to narrow it to the first thing that I was able to write. So this presentation is called Mr. Hussein Goes to Baghdad, Reagan and the Decision to Share Intelligence with Iraq. Now, when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th, 1981, the Iran-Iraq war had already been underway for about 4 months and had entered a stalemate, with Iraqi troops occupying a small section of Iranian territory to the east of the Shatt al-Arab waterway. So here we got a little diagram of how far Iraq made it into Iranian territory. It was not a lot. Now, upon entering office, the Reagan administration undertook a review of the Carter administration's policies towards the war and concluded that maintaining the policy of strict neutrality was probably the best way forward. However, no less than 18 months later, a CIA officer arrived in Baghdad using the alias Mr. Hussein, bearing gifts in the form of tactical intelligence on Iranian troop formations that were preparing to lay siege to Basra, Iraq's second largest city. Mosul is not as big as Basra, which the media hasn't quite figured that out. So I asked myself, how did the United States go from being a neutral party in the Iran-Iraq War in 1981 to tilting towards Iraq in mid-1982 through the provision of tactical intelligence? To answer this question, my talk today is going to examine the evidence showing the Reagan administration's decision to abandon its policy of strict neutrality and to provide Iraq with tactical intelligence. What will become evident is that the threat Iran posed to Iraq at this point in the war and to the wider region was so grave that the Reagan administration felt it had no other option but to help Iraq. Now, at the outbreak of the war, on September 22nd, 1980, the Carter administration adopted a policy of strict neutrality, which I'd mentioned. Now, what this meant was that it would support neither belligerent nor sell them weapons. Carter believed that this would offer the United States the most flexibility in responding to the crisis, but in reality, neither belligerent at the time was particularly interested in working with the United States. On the one hand, Iran was still holding 52 Americans hostage and did not particularly like the United States at that juncture. And Iraq had severed relations with the US in 1967, but had also grown a lot more angry with the United States when it was revealed in 1976 that the CIA had been providing the Kurds in the north with a lot of support, and this was revealed in a leaked congressional investigation report. If you want to learn more about this, I would normally be like, hey, go read my book on this topic, but I'm not going to do that. Now, by January, what was that, John? By January 1981, the war was not going particularly well for Iraq, and as they had hoped. Winter rains had waterlogged the region, bogging the Iraqi forces down in the mud, and mechanized vehicles were unable to really move. Having failed to take a strategic crossroad in Iraq's initial offensive, Iranian forces were then able to regroup and focus on ejecting Iraq from their territory. Just prior to Reagan taking office, Iran launched a lumbering counterattack at Dezful, hoping to push back the Iraqi advance, leading to one of the largest tank battles in history. Now, after initial breakthrough, Iraqi forces managed to regroup and envelop the attacking Iranians. The failure of Iran's January offensive, according to a 1981 State Department review of the war, quote, seriously weakened Tehran's ability to conduct successful large-scale offensive operations for at least the rest of the year. The State Department reasoned that Iran had expended a large part of its tactical assets and had been unable to, quote, acquire weapons, ammunition, and spare parts sufficient to offset the expenditures and losses. In other words, the Iran-Iraq War had settled into a stalemate, and there was little that the United States could do to change the scope or dynamic of the war. Now, during the first 2 months in office, the Reagan administration conducted a review of the existing policies, and by mid-March 1981, an interagency working group had completed its review, prompting Secretary Haig to cable the new guidance to all diplomatic and consular posts. According to the cable, the war, now in its 6th month, was, quote, on the threshold of a new phase. All diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire had failed, and an upsurge in fighting was now likely. The cable affirmed the continuation of the neutrality policy on the basis that coming out in support of Iraq could push Iran into the arms of the Soviet Union, which of course would go against containment. Now, the new guidance suggested that the working group was concerned with the resumption of fighting, particularly the likelihood that it would destroy Iran's oil facilities. But in addition to that, it could broaden the war to include other nearby countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE. Now, The Reagan administration's official position on the conflict was, quote, to avoid taking sides, to seek to prevent a widening of the conflict, and to support credible, independent initiatives to find a negotiated settlement. In light of this, the cable informs American diplomats that the U.S. would continue its policy of not selling defense articles and services to Iraq and Iran. In short, the Reagan administration had affirmed the Carter administration's policy of neutrality. Now, between the spring of 1981 and April 1982, Iran launched a series of counteroffensives that drove Iraq off the bulk of its territory that it had occupied in the initial offensive. In doing so, Iran shifted the momentum of the war back into its favor and put the Iraqis on the defensive. Now, Iran's battlefield victories really concerned U.S. policymakers. On May 5th, Paul Wolfowitz, the State Department's Director of Policy Planning, sent Secretary Haig a memo outlining his thoughts on an analysis that had been prepared by the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, which was on the war. Now, Wolfowitz identified two factors shaping U.S. policy. First, there was, quote, precious little the U.S. could do to affect or influence the outcome of the war. Second, whatever the outcome of the war may be, Iran is certain to emerge in a dominant position. Moreover, Wolfowitz revealed that the Saudis had been pressing the Reagan administration to help the Iraqis directly. This shows that the Reagan administration was deeply concerned about the growth of Iran's power, which pushed it into considering steps that it might not otherwise not have done, like providing them with intelligence. Now, at this point, because my paper was just far too long and there's so many little facets to this, I'm just going to jump to kind of the evidence. Now, here we got, this is kind of a satellite photo where you can actually see the defensive lines that the Iraqis had built. In June 1982, as it became increasingly apparent that Iran was building up its forces outside Basra, the NSC staff drew up plans to provide Iraq with tactical intelligence on Iranian troop movements. According to Bruce Rydell, who was monitoring the war at the time in the CIA, the Reagan administration, when faced with the possibility of an Iranian victory, had roughly two options. One, it could either let Iraq continue to fall apart and concede victory to Iran, or two, try to help Iraq out. Now, around this same time, the U.S. intelligence community circulated a special national intelligence estimate called The Implications of Iran's Victory over Iraq. The estimate's conclusion was blunt. Iraq has essentially lost the war with Iran. Baghdad's concern now is to prevent an Iranian invasion. However, there is little the Iraqis can do, alone or in combination with the other Arabs, to reverse the military situation. It was at this point that the Reagan administration began to seriously consider the option of providing Iraq with intelligence. According to a signed affidavit by Howard Teacher, the senior analyst on the NSC staff for the Near East, it was in June 1982 that the president agreed to provide Iraq with tactical intelligence when he signed a national security decision directive. As Teacher noted, President Reagan decided that and this is a quote, as you can see, decided that the United States could not afford to allow Iraq to lose the war with Iran. President Reagan decided that the United States would do whatever was necessary and legal to prevent Iraq from losing the war with Iran. President Reagan formalized this policy by issuing a national security decision directive. I have personal knowledge with this NSDD because I co-authored the NSDD with another NSC staff member, Jeff Kemp. Significantly, Teacher said that the NSDD called for the U.S. to supply the Iraqis with billions of dollars in credits by providing U.S. military and intelligence and advice to the Iraqis, and by closely monitoring third-party arms sales to Iraq to make sure that Iraq has the necessary military equipment. However, the problem with Teacher's affidavit is that either no record of the NSDD in question, there's no record, I cannot find the NSDD, or it just still remains classified. However, his statement has since been supported by firsthand testimony by U.S. officials directly involved with the provision of intelligence. Meanwhile, in the dark of night on July 13th and 14th, Iran launched Operation Ramadan, which sought to overwhelm Iraq's defenses outside Basra. According to a July 14th CIA analysis of the Basra offensive, the offensive was the largest land battle since the Korean War, involving some 250,000 Iraqi and Iranian troops. So Iran had 150,000, Iraq had 100,000. Fearing the Iranian invasion, over the previous month, the Iraqis rushed to construct a complex network of defenses on the outside of Basra, which we saw in that image before, including trenches, anti-tank ditches, sand berms, and the flooding of Fish Lake, which was packed with mines, concertina wire, and fallen power lines to electrocute anyone who went into it. The CIA concluded that Iraq's outlook was not good unless its forces managed to hold off the initial Iranian thrust, and then their morale will grow. On July 20th, Paul Bremer circulated a discussion paper in preparation for an interagency meeting on policy implications for the Iran-Iraq war the following day. It suggested, for the first time, that the U.S. consider sharing intelligence with Iraq. After reviewing the importance of maintaining the neutrality policy, the paper noted that Egypt and Jordan had been strongly urging the U.S. to consider tilting towards Iraq and to counter the Iranian threat to the region. Given this, the purpose of the paper was to examine the options the U.S. had at its disposal to tilt towards Iraq, but in a manner that did not preclude future improvements with relations with Iran. The paper noted, quote, "A key consideration in deciding whether to tilt towards Iraq is its impact on Iran." Of the options available, the most attractive was the provision of tactical intelligence, particularly, quote, "real-time tactical intelligence, either directly or indirectly through third parties." However, the paper notes that sharing intelligence was not without its risks. Iran could find out. Prior to this, the U.S. had limited its intelligence sharing with Iraq to kind of more generalized after-action reports being like, you guys screwed up on this, you didn't on that, maybe you should focus more on the things you're good at. Unfortunately, however, given the surreptitious nature of intelligence sharing, the risk of Iran finding out was less likely. As a result, a note in the margins of the paper pointed out that the JCS, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were in favor of this option. Unfortunately, the details of the interagency group's meeting are still classified. On July 24th, so a couple days later, Bremer circulated a revised version of the July 20th discussion paper in preparation for a senior interagency group meeting, or a SIG meeting, that was to be held on the 26th. Unlike the July 20th paper, the new draft was much more explicit in the endorsement of providing intelligence. The analysis reflected a sincere desire to maintain neutrality in the war, but also the reality that Iran posed a serious threat to the region. Quote, "We want to deprive either Khomeini or Saddam Hussein of a military victory and want to avoid adopting policies and postures that are demonstrably ineffective in leading towards a negotiated settlement or military stalemate." However, the paper's discussion on intelligence sharing came out firmly in favor of this option. Baghdad's most basic need, the analysis observed, is for accurate and timely intelligence on Iranian unit and equipment dispositions of Iranian intentions. The analysis went on to note that while providing real-time or near real-time information on Iran's battle order was not without its risk, quote, "strategic intelligence can play a significant role in helping Iraq defend against Iranian incursions." Despite the risk, the paper concluded, quote, "Of all the options reviewed by the IG, or the interagency group, this option has the greatest attraction. It could have an immediate impact on the war and maintains at least some degree of plausible deniability." According to the minutes of the senior interagency group meeting held on the 26th, the group felt that, quote, "While an Iranian victory over Iraq was not in the U.S. interest, there was little that any outsider could do to offset the training and leadership weaknesses of the Iraqi forces, who were well equipped with Soviet material. Given this, the SIG determined that providing material assistance or weaponry to Iraq was not in America's interests and agreed to maintain the policy of neutrality. Now, Interestingly, the minutes of the meeting do not make any reference to providing intelligence. However, the next day, on July 27th, a CIA officer named Thomas Twetton arrived in Baghdad and checked into a hotel using the name Mr. Hussein. That was the name Iraqi military intelligence had given him when he and another CIA analyst arrived abruptly at Baghdad airport with a briefcase full of tactical intelligence, showing the battle lines about 10 to 15 miles beyond the border. Twetton's account of the exchange, which is given in the book Becoming Enemies, which is an amazing book if you ever get a chance to read it, it described the Iraqis as being shocked at the sudden arrival of the CIA messenger in Baghdad. It was obvious from the reactions, this is a quote, it was obvious from their reactions that we had provided them with something they regarded as very significant to them. It was clear that they hadn't seen anything like this before. Twetton explained that the CIA intelligence led to an Iraqi turf war over who would sponsor his presence, with military intelligence being very keen to gain access to the intelligence, but the secret police very much opposed to the idea. They didn't like even the suggestion that they needed help from the United States. Now, Twetton, of course, sat down with them and said, President Reagan sent me here to give you this intelligence. You don't want to go against what President Reagan suggests. And you might want to think about this before you kick me out of the country. Now, a few days later, the Iraqis had a change of heart, telling Twetton that they would look into this information and assess its quality. Now, within a few months, the Iraqis asked the CIA to set up a station in the interest section, showing that they clearly did appreciate this intelligence. And perhaps it's no coincidence that on July 27th, President Reagan wrote in his diary that he had met with the NSC and had approved, quote, some covert operations. Now, on to my conclusion. There's little question that the Reagan administration agreed to provide Iraq with tactical intelligence. After all, there's documentary evidence that senior U.S. officials had discussed the option as a viable means of preventing an Iranian victory. A sworn affidavit from the NSC staff's Director of Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, and the first-hand account of a CIA official who first went to Baghdad to physically hand intelligence over to the Iraqis. However, the problem is that the specific document authorizing the CIA's intelligence sharing has not been declassified or doesn't exist. This would have likely come in the form of an NSDD, which Teacher referenced in his sworn affidavit. Nevertheless, it is clear that the U.S. did, in fact, provide Iraq with tactical intelligence that had a measurable effect on the ability of the Iraqis to defend against Iranian human wave offensives outside Basra, and eventually went on to win the war in August 1988. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Our next speaker is Douglas Little of Clark University, and he's going to, his talk is titled Bedtime for Bonzo, Ronald Reagan and the Muslim World. And I would assume it's connected to your new book.
I hope so.
All right, we'll see.
That's the plan. All right. I got an acute case of PowerPoint envy watching Ambassador. Why is that not going on? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, now wait a minute. That's okay. So I can see what's next. Okay. All right. So I got an acute case of PowerPoint envy. I had restrained myself from doing a PowerPoint because my students know that if I do a lecture and a PowerPoint, a 50-minute lecture becomes 75 minutes, and I've got 15 minutes. So let me go ahead and get started. Nearly 3 decades after leaving office, Ronald Reagan remains a heroic figure in the eyes of most Americans. You remember that he was once upstaged by a chimpanzee in the B-movie Bedtime for Bonzo, so I thought I would remind us. But everyone knows he tamed the Russian bear and won the Cold War. On the 100th anniversary of Reagan's birth in 2011, a Gallup poll showed that Americans ranked him as the greatest president of all time, 5 points ahead of Abraham Lincoln. But America's 40th president was much less popular in the Muslim world, as Middle East expert turned pollster Shibli Telami discovered during a trip to several Arab capitals shortly after Reagan left office. The level of anger with the U.S. in early 1990 Telami recalled long afterwards, was comparable to the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. I'd like to suggest this afternoon that the very angry environment that Telami encountered in early 1990 stemmed from ill-advised U.S. policies during the 1980s. After examining the worldview of the Reagan National Security Team, I'll look briefly at 3 case studies: the attempt to create a strategic consensus between Israel and conservative Muslim regimes, the showdown with Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, and the decision to play with fire by encouraging radical Islam in Afghanistan. Bottom line, most of the problems America confronts in the Muslim world today as we enter the age of Trump are the legacy of bad times for Bonzo during the age of Reagan. When Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, he already possessed strong views about foreign affairs in general and U.S. policy toward the Middle East in particular. Everyone knows that the great communicator viewed the world through a Cold War lens. Anti-communism may have been the principal ingredient in Reagan's recipe for handling the Muslim world, but 2 other elements were also on prominent display: Christian millennialism and American Orientalism. Although President Reagan was not a born-again Christian like his predecessor, he was fascinated by tales of impending Armageddon and was well acquainted with evangelical leaders like Pat Robertson, who prophesied that once Israel gained control of the entire Holy Land, the end of days would arrive. In short, Reagan saw the Middle East as, quote, a place where the senseless spilling of blood in the name of religious faith has gone on since biblical times. If Bible stories encouraged Reagan to look with favor on Israel, traditional Orientalist stereotypes embedded in American popular culture shaped his perceptions of Islam. The future president's earliest impressions of Muslims quite likely came from a pair of classics that first appeared in 1911, the year he was born: David Saville Muzzey's An American History, a best-selling textbook, and the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Wikipedia of its day, both of which, and the 1911 version is really worth reading, both of which depicted Arabs and Turks as revengeful, cruel, untruthful, and superstitious barbarians. While in Hollywood during the 1940s, Reagan enjoyed watching films produced by his employer, Warner Brothers, whose list of B movies included Adventure in Iraq, which featured pro-Nazi Arab devil worshippers. This is the worst B movie ever made, including the ones that Reagan started. No, that's not fair. 2 of his favorite magazines, Human Events and Commentary, regularly excoriated Arab and Islamic radicals. Not surprisingly, President Reagan worried that bloodthirsty fanatics might soon hold sway throughout the Muslim world. I don't think you can overestimate the importance of Islamic fundamentalism, he warned in his memoirs, especially if, as seems possible, its most fanatical elements get their hands on nuclear and chemical weapons. Key members of Reagan's national security team shared this mindset. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, a West Point graduate with solid anti-Soviet credentials, regarded the word Palestinian as a synonym for terrorist, and he worried that, quote, a radical Islamic Moor-based movement would threaten all moderate Arab states. Orientalism, right? Haig appointed Paul Wolfowitz, an emerging neoconservative superstar, as director of his policy planning staff. He tapped L. Paul Jerry Bremer, another future neocon notable, as his executive secretary, and he surrounded himself with Islamophobes like Michael Ledeen and Israelophiles like Harvey Sickerman. Haig's successor, George Shultz, was more pragmatic and less temperamental, but his close connections with the House of Saud, dating from his stint as a CEO at the Bechtel Corporation, ensured that Arab and Islamic radicals would continue to have few friends at Foggy Bottom. Reagan's first national security advisor was Richard V. Allen, another gruff Cold Warrior with close ties to pro-Israel groups like AIPAC. Allen assembled an NSC staff that included 27-year-old Douglas Feith, who regarded Israel as a strategic asset. 3 of Allen's 5 successors as NSC advisor, Bud McFarlane, John Poindexter, and Colin Powell, were career military officers who saw Islamic radicals as little more than incipient terrorists. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger described Shia Muslims as anti-Western fanatics whose, quote, real goal was waging jihad against Americans and other infidels. CIA Director William Casey, an ardent Catholic and OSS veteran addicted to covert action, was eager to launch a crusade against Islamic extremists and Soviet-backed Arab radicals from Lebanon to South Yemen. Reagan relied heavily on his seasoned team of national security advisors because his own knowledge of the Muslim world was quite limited. Candidate Reagan knew nothing about the sectarian rivalries that fueled Lebanon's civil war, telling an interviewer in February 1980, "I can't see why they're fighting. After all, they're all Lebanese." According to Britain's Margaret Thatcher, even after 8 years in the Oval Office, Reagan had not shown the slightest interest in the Middle East. I think Maggie was being unfair. As Ambassador Edelman said, I think she was sort of handbagging him on that. He was interested, but not interested enough. The one thing Reagan did know was that America must recognize the Israeli asset and fill the power void left east of Suez by the British, as he put it in that Washington Post op-ed that Seth quoted earlier. Reagan's ideas resonated with Alexander Haig, who pressed for a strategic consensus between the Israelis and pro-American Muslim conservatives. To be sure, there were some squabbles with Israel over the proposed sale of AWACS surveillance aircraft to the Saudis in 1981, the Jonathan Pollard spy case in 1985, and the U.S. decision to establish ties with the PLO in 1988. But from the very start, the Reagan administration saw the Jewish state as a strategic asset, not as a strategic liability. The Israeli raid on the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak in June 1981 wrecked Haig's strategic consensus, but as Ori and Jordana pointed out earlier today, Douglas Feith and other friends of Israel inside the Reagan National Security Team made sure that this did not damage the special relationship. With help from the NSC staff, Haig persuaded Reagan that what many saw as Israel's aggressive raid on Osirak was actually a defensive maneuver. "One day you will get down on your knees," Haig predicted, "and thank Israel for doing that." It should not come as a surprise, then, that as Seth has shown in his paper earlier, Alexander Haig welcomed Israel's June 1982 invasion of Lebanon as a lobotomy designed to disable the PLO and send a message to a rogues gallery of pro-Palestinian radicals like Muammar Gaddafi, whom Ronald Reagan loathed. Reagan's long-standing grudge against Gaddafi reflected a blend of anti-communism, millennialism, and Orientalism. In early 1971, while still governor of California, Reagan had invoked a weird lesson from the book of Ezekiel. "It says that the land of Israel will come under attack by the armies of the ungodly nations, and it says that Libya will be among them," he explained. "Libya has now gone communist, and that's a sign that the day of Armageddon isn't far off." After Reagan moved into the White House 10 years later, the CIA confirmed his worst fears, branding Gaddafi as a pro-Soviet Muslim zealot afflicted with Bedouin characteristics of naive idealism, religious fanaticism, and xenophobia. In March 1981, President Reagan established a senior interdepartmental group, or SIG, to explore ways to deal with Gaddafi. The SIG soon recommended providing covert assistance to exile Libyan opposition groups and deploying the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Gulf of Sidra, which Gaddafi claimed as territorial waters, off-limits to foreign warships. Reagan approved both recommendations and discussed the rules of engagement at an NSC meeting on July 31st. Not going forward with a naval show of force would invite further loss of confidence among our regional allies, Caspar Weinberger told the president. "Backing down was not an option," Reagan replied, and I love this next quote. "We should proceed with the operation unless they decide to drain the bay." He likened Americans' problems with Gaddafi to, and this is another quote, "to the story of the Benedictine monks who had a rule to treat visitors with open arms, but should the visitors get unruly, they were to be taken out back by some hefty monks and shown the errors of their ways." 3 weeks later, a Sixth Fleet task force crossed Gaddafi's line of death and was buzzed by a squadron of Libyan fighter bombers. There were no Benedictine monks piloting the U.S. Navy jets that responded, but when the shooting stopped, 2 Libyan warplanes had gone down in flames, something that Reagan and Weinberger hoped would show Gaddafi the error of his ways. There is no photo of that scene, but somehow it popped up. I must have done something. This is how I imagine it went down. This is the end zone dance. And once I learned how to do Photoshop, I became a really dangerous guy. So I photoshopped my head on Alexander Haig's body. So anyway, just wish I'd been there, but I wasn't. This episode would set the tone for Reagan's dealings with Libya during the next 7 years. In October 1981, I'm afraid the next slide's going to come up. I don't want it to come up. In October 1981, Michael Ledeen, a State Department consultant who would later become notorious for helping to orchestrate the Iran-Contra arms for hostages swap, delivered a blueprint for more aggressive steps against Libya. Relying on information provided by Israeli intelligence and his own overactive imagination, Ledeen claimed that Gaddafi, with help from the PLO, was training 5,000 anti-American radicals, not just from the Middle East, but also from countries as diverse as Niger, Nicaragua, and the Philippines. Ledeen's alarmist report confirmed what Reagan's national security team wanted to hear, but the White House was hard-pressed to fashion an effective response. Another naval show of force in Libyan waters was certain to spark charges that Reagan was merely seeking a pretext for military intervention. An American oil boycott would not stop Gaddafi from bankrolling the PLO and other radical groups unless Western Europe followed suit. And even though the CIA maintained excellent contacts inside Libya, covert encouragement for an anti-Gaddafi coup risked igniting a civil war. The White House eventually imposed stiff economic sanctions, but fresh evidence soon surfaced that Libya was still meddling in North Africa. According to Howard Teicher, one of the NFC's chief Middle East experts, in early 1984, Reagan was convinced that it was necessary to remove Gaddafi from power. And Reagan approved another round of CIA paramilitary actions, including, quote, sabotage and violence, which could promote further challenges to Gaddafi's authority by disaffected elements in the military. Unfazed by this new covert offensive, Gaddafi vowed to back terrorist operations against U.S. personnel or facilities beyond the Middle East. He embraced Abu Nidal, a Palestinian thug responsible for bloody attacks in Rome and Vienna in late 1985, and he dared the U.S. Navy once again to cross the line of death. More gunboat diplomacy ensued in short order, with American warplanes sinking 2 Libyan patrol boats in the Gulf of Sidra in late March 1986. 3 weeks later, a bomb ripped through a discotheque in West Berlin, killing 1 GI and wounding 50 others. Although the CIA suspected that Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist group behind the attack on the U.S. Marine barracks at the Beirut airport 3 years earlier, was responsible, Reagan blamed Gaddafi, whom he branded the mad dog of the Middle East, and authorized a series of airstrikes on Tripoli on April 16th that left nearly 100 dead. Gaddafi survived the attack and reemerged in September with some harsh words. Reagan has to read history. He reads cheap Hollywood scenarios, and that is the problem in the world today, namely a second-rate actor with, a second-rate actor becomes the president of the biggest power. Gaddafi would get his revenge in December 1988 high over Lockerbie, Scotland, where a bomb planted by Libyan agents brought down Pan Am Flight 103, killing 270 people, 180 of them Americans. A painstaking FBI investigation subsequently confirmed that Pan Am 103 was Gaddafi's bloody blowback from 8 years of covert action and saber-rattling directed against Libya. If Reagan's embrace of Israel as a strategic asset and his resort to gunboat diplomacy against Libya helped shape the U.S. approach to the Middle East for a generation, his most lasting legacy was this mishandling of radical Islam from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, where a series of short-sighted decisions put America on a collision course with Muslim extremists. Much has been written about Operation Cyclone, the Reagan administration's covert campaign to expel the Red Army from Afghanistan by running guns to Mujahideen guerrillas with help from Mohammad Zia al-Haq, Pakistan's ruthless and opportunistic dictator. And I've got a picture of him, I think. There he is. Next line. An increasingly militant Islamist who looked a lot like Bela Lugosi in Dracula. People have told me I'm being unfair to Bela Lugosi. Zia ensured that the most powerful U.S. weapons, including shoulder-launched Stinger missiles, found their way into the hands of the most radical Afghan jihadis. By the late 1980s, Muslim volunteers from around the world, Filipinos, Uzbeks, Uyghurs, and hundreds of Arabs, including a young engineer from Saudi Arabia named Osama bin Laden, had joined forces with the Mujahideen. We are fighting a jihad, Pakistan's intelligence chief explained, and this is the First Islamic International Brigade. From the very start, however, the CIA's William Casey had downplayed signs of religious extremism and chose instead to present the Mujahideen as freedom fighters like the fabled French resistance from his glory days at the OSS. For his part, Reagan began inviting Afghan witnesses, as we saw yesterday, to the White House, vowing that we must and will continue to give aid to the freedom fighters. Reagan's national security team was delighted, of course, to keep the Red Army bogged down in a Vietnam-like quagmire in Afghanistan, but what made a Mujahideen victory even more attractive was the possibility that Islamic extremism might spread from Afghanistan to Soviet Central Asia. As early as 1981, the CIA was smuggling Uzbek language copies of the Quran to Muslim dissidents in Tashkent. And before long, rumors were flying that American spooks, with help from Pakistan, were also bankrolling a campaign of sabotage. By 1983, CIA analysts reported that the Kremlin feared that a wave of Islamic fanaticism, triggered by a Russian defeat in Afghanistan or by an Iranian victory in the Iran-Iraq War, quote, might potentially attract adherents among the USSR's own 43 million Muslims. 4 years later, President Zia confirmed that this was the key to Pakistan's game plan. The new power will be really Islamic, he told a reporter, a part of the Islamic resistance, which you will see will someday extend itself to the Soviet Muslim community. By early 1988, however, there were indications that the United States itself might well become the target of transnational Islamic jihad. Reagan was startled to learn in January that an Iranian patrol boat recently captured by U.S. naval forces in the Persian Gulf, quote, was armed with a Stinger missile we had given to the Mujahideen. 5 months later, even more troubling news arrived. Zia has declared Islamic law in Pakistan, Reagan confided in his diary. That puts him into the fundamentalist revolution with the Ayatollah and Gaddafi. In short, the backfire from Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan was undermining the firewall that Washington wanted to erect in the Persian Gulf to prevent revolutionary Iran from meddling in Lebanon, where Hezbollah held half a dozen hostages. Brian Gibson has already described the fallout from Reagan's meddling in the Iran-Iraq War, so I don't need to repeat the gory details there. I do find it highly ironic, however, that Reagan believed that his handling of Iran was one of the high points of his foreign policy in the Middle East. Here's a quote from the summer of 1988. Reagan, Iran wanted to be a fundamentalist superpower from the Gulf to Indonesia, he told George Shultz and Colin Powell on July 29th, a few days after Ayatollah Khomeini sued for peace. We stood up and contained Iran, just as we should have done with Hitler. Ronald Reagan was not a big fan of irony in the Muslim world or anywhere else. Neither is Donald Trump. Our new president has been echoing the great communicator's hatred of big government, his faith in voodoo economics, and his tendency to shoot first and ask questions later in the Middle East. If, as many on the right seem to believe, Trump does prove to be the second coming of Ronald Reagan, it will merely prove the accuracy of Karl Marx's famous dictum that history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. I'll take about 10 minutes and with some general comments and specific questions to the presenters and then open it up. As you can see from the papers, the 1980s are quite complex. We have the Lebanese Civil War that starts in 1975 and develops into really a regional conflict. Not only the destruction of Lebanon, Syria is involved, Israel is involved, the Palestinians are heavily involved. We have the Iran-Iraq War, another theater of warfare in the region, which is actually one of the longest, if not the longest, state-to-state conflict in the 20th century, and one of the nastiest for sure. We have Gaddafi, who was never taken very seriously in the Middle East by Arabs, but apparently is taken very seriously by Reagan, staging himself as the kind of a proto-Bin Laden for the Americans, but staging himself as a replacer to Gamal Abdel Nasser, really. Assuming some importance with terrorist actions. We have the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, which comes in relation to the war in Lebanon, and we have something which is developing as a kind of a civil war in Egypt between the Mubarak regime and the Islamists, and the emergence of the state of emergency regime as a new kind of political ontology that Egyptians were accustomed to live with since then. If you contrast this to the 70s, where you can send Henry Kissinger with a baseball bat to beat people up into submission and make them do this and that, you can see that these kind of politics are not going to work in the 80s. The scene becomes fractured, fragmented. States are less and less involved, there's actually not one single address to go to, and no single mechanism of political pressure to assign. Now, the question is, and looking at all the papers here, reading them, I came up with a kind of a dual vision or a dual understanding of what the Reagan administration is. I'm thinking Middle Eastern. Right, on the one hand, it seems to me, just even from the last talk, that this is a very inept administration that doesn't get it, that doesn't understand who is involved, that is reacting rather than shaping, and perhaps not interested at all, but certainly not shaping a direction that leads somewhere. On the other hand, if you read Seth's paper, it seems like, with the Palestinians, but also eventually with Brian's, with the Iraqis, the administration is weighing evidence, able to adjust, able to respond to some degree. So for all, and thinking about Flavia's paper, if an administration is so inept in one area of the world, how come it is so apt in South Africa, which we presented, very a success story, basically, that requires a lot of, also a complex understanding of realities on the ground, several languages, several players. Maybe it's a classic Cold War history, we're familiar with from Latin America, for example, whereas the Middle East is not. But what is really going on in the 80s, not only with Reagan himself, but with the administration. Now, related to this, we also need to ask ourselves something about who are actually the people who are doing the policy. What is happening in the bureaucracy? We tend to think of administrations and presidents and not rarely, I think, pay really attention to the bureaucracy itself. Now, if you compare, for example, the people who work in Washington today, who've been trained after 9/11 when millions and millions of dollars were poured into, at least my field, history of the Middle East, to train people in languages, to send them to the region to live in for 1 year. All of these people come to Washington with excellent Arabic. After living in the region for at least 1 year, they're fluent, they're fluent in literary Arabic and maybe 2 more dialects if they come up with most of the programs. And most interestingly, they haven't passed through Israel. All the people that Doug mentioned, or a lot of them, had a very serious connection in the bureaucracy to Israel, because that was a place in the 80s and way into the 90s for which you go, and still with relation to the war in Iraq, for which you go to find local expertise that did not exist in DC. Today it's of course very different. There's a level of expertise that is homemade here, that is of high level. What you do with it in terms of decision making is something else, but the knowledge is here. What suggests to me that we need to look into a little bit into the bureaucracy and especially the connections with Israel, not simply as a political connections, an asset, not an asset, or a bond. A lot of Jewish Americans are going to are being involved. It's not that Martin Indyk and Dennis Ross are coming out of nowhere. One can actually make the connections into academia as well, and so on and so forth. But there's obviously a shift. So maybe Doug, you'll be in a position to comment on that as well. Now, the other thing is a little bit of a conundrum here. Look, the Reagan years in the Middle East are actually connected to 2 major events that come before and after. First of all, Carter's legacy, which is the peace process between Egyptians and Israelis, and the creation of this triangular relationship, Egypt, Israel, and the US, which is completely an unlikely triangle, but one of the most long-lasting, viable structures that the US had in the region. Both Israel and Egypt are dependent for a few $1 billion, 3 and 2, I think, respectively, for military aid. And it's not only military aid, it's all sorts of other aid. And that creates, in a way, a structure that was stable and function. And perhaps this did not feature in the papers, of course, but it's important to us to understand that the Reagan administration does inherit a very viable structure in the region. And so there is some levels of continuity. And on the other hand, as the right after the, a few years after Reagan leaves office, we have the first Gulf War. Iraq, that was kind of an ally or discovered as an ally, actually exposes its real motivation, historical motivation to swallow Kuwait. And the Gulf War is, to a degree, also a continuity, or there's a certain continuity from the Gulf War from what people in the Reagan administrations were doing and understanding. So I'll also ask members of the panel to try and connect the Reagan administration as much as possible to what was before and after. And I have to say, with regard to Carter, especially with Reagan, it's in the Arab world, Carter is seen as opposed to the U.S., where he seems as a loser because of the hostage crisis in Tehran. In the Middle East, it seems as a very serious guy, much more serious than Reagan. And Reagan, who seemed here as a hero that won the Cold War and so on and so forth, is the person who escaped from Beirut after the bombing of the Marines barracks by Hezbollah, thus providing the Hezbollah with its founding myth that one truck of a suicide bomber would basically drive the Americans away. The historical realities show us that actually it could be that Carter was the more significant person and not Reagan. Now, finally, a few specifics to the participants. For Seth, I wonder, how come Hamas did not figure in the calculations of the Americans? It's very nice transformations that they moved towards the PLO. But given the emergence of the first Intifada in 1987, where the prominence of Hamas on the day-to-day activities of how to run the Intifada become quite clear, I would assume that people in the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv are taking note of that. Are they trying to rush to accept the PLO as an antidote to Hamas, or are they at all aware of that? And also, if you can connect it to the Madrid process, which is another big thing that comes after the beginning of the peace process. Also, Seth, with regard to the Israelis, I was just wondering, this panel comes right after we just seen what the Israelis were doing in Iraq with the bombing of the nuclear plant. Wasn't it clear to Alexander Haig when he talks to Sharon that Sharon's kind of off the cuff, kind of relaxed comments about little order they're going to do in Lebanon should be taken very, very seriously? Brian, I had a question again regarding Iraq. It's obvious that the Americans understand that Iran is a menace, that if Iran takes over, that means a certain upset for the structure of Iraq as well, the Gulf states and so on. But weren't they aware of the fact that Iraq has an historic motivation and a historic will to swallow Kuwait, to take over Kuwait? And that Saddam Hussein is actually an equally problematic partner, even though he's a Sunni and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis are Sunnis as well. And Doug, I have one question to you. You take as your almost like subject of analysis the Muslim world, but the Muslim world is not a political unit. It's not, you cannot have a policy towards the Muslim world because it's not organized in any way. They have one Muslim kind of general organization that, what I understand, they have a hard time deciding what they'll have for lunch together. I mean, it's not, a very consensual kind of organization. So how exactly does it work politically? Or are we into the realm of basically an image that the U.S. have on some Muslim world and a counter image that the Muslim have towards the U.S., which is of course important politically, but it moves us from power politics as such. And finally, Flavia, I wonder if in your source material you saw, I mean, obviously you have one guy running this, this effort quite successfully, but I wonder if there was any relationship to Latin America as well as another place where you can make a similar breakthrough, similar realities at the time. And one last comment in general, look, we have very hard time understanding what is happening in the Arab world itself. We don't have state archives. Just figuring out what is the political process, the diplomatic process in the Middle East is very complex. So I just want to say kind of a methodological comment on how to go about it. You know, when thinking about what kind of source material in Arabic exists for me to, you know, to revise before this panel, I was reminded that last year I got as a present the autobiography of Clovis Maqsood. Clovis Maqsood, for those of you who don't know, is an Arab American from Cleveland who moved to Beirut, to American University of Beirut, and becomes throughout the second part of the 20th century one of the most respected and influential Arab diplomats for the Arab League, and also ambassador in Washington to the UN, and also the head of the clubs of Arab ambassadors in Washington, which is important. Now, Clovis Maqsood, of course, has a thick chapter about the 80s, about the Reagan years. He talks about Palestinians, where basically he didn't get very far with your people there, but he tried. Also, quite a lot about Gaddafi. Now, this source material that he has, and you can find in other memoirs, is you cannot necessarily take it just at sort of at face value. You have to read it against journalistic account from the region, maybe more interviews, but ultimately I think that the Arab perspective could be salvaged. It's kind of a major effort, mostly in Arabic, but it could be salvaged, and I think it would substantiate a lot of, you know, how we consider, you know, the American diplomatic involvement in the region. So thank you, and we'll open the floor. Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for great presentations. Hi, everyone. Thank you for great presentations. I'm Ori from the panel before. So I'll spread out some questions. So to Doug and Seth, Reagan has been described in the literature as being willing to use the whip of sanctions against Israel much more than his predecessors, especially Carter, despite his sympathy. So if you can maybe add to that or frame that. And to Brian, can you tell us anything about Haig's and his and the other folks in the administrations, their hopes about Saddam Hussein making a U-turn and becoming this possible ally, potential ally, becoming more sensible? And to Flavia, have you seen anything relating to Chester Crocker and constructive engagement that relates to the nuclear policies and the thinking? Thanks.
Maybe we could start answering and then go ahead.
Well, I'm going to start. I want to respond first, Yoav, to your overarching point, which is the conundrum of how you deal with Carter's legacy and whether the peace with Egypt shapes what's happening in the 1980s. Now, I would first start and sort of make a broader point that there's a fundamental misreading of Carter and Camp David, which is part of what my broader project looks at, which is the tendency to read Camp David as a great success story because of its removal of Egypt from the equation. And I think that there's a reason why this dominant frame has existed. But in particular, if you look closely at the other consequences of Camp David, particularly regarding Palestinian autonomy and the wider Arab world, the story is much more complicated. And in perpetuating notions of limited autonomy and self-rule for Palestinians, without having Egypt as an issue anymore, it actually enables a certain overextension of Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. Salim Yacoub has a brand new book called Imperfect Strangers, which also looks at the results of Camp David and is worth reading in this regard. And it actually, in a way, therefore, frees up certain realities in the 1980s that didn't exist before. So part of the reason you can't have Kissinger going around with a baseball bat is that Camp David is in many ways a fulfillment of his vision in shuttle diplomacy, that you remove Egypt and you allow Israel to maintain its presence. In terms of some of the particular questions, well, in the question about Hamas, I mean, there you have an interesting story in its own right, because for the Israelis, Hamas is actually seen as an Islamist bulwark against secular Palestinian nationalism. They're sort of subtly supported. And in the American view, they aren't taken that seriously, although when they are taken seriously and they appear in early 1988, they're not part of the mainstream discussions of secular Palestinian nationalism, which is the main focus of U.S. diplomats in Jerusalem. And as for the question about Reagan and whether he was willing to engage with sanctions, well, when the annexation of the Golan Heights happened, there was specifically very clear action by the administration. Weinberger exclaims, you know, how long do we have to go on bribing Israel? There's a suspension of potential arms sales, and Begin is furious. He says, are we a state or vassal of yours? Are we a banana republic? And there's a very, very, very difficult exchange. And then the final point I want to make is on the methodology. I agree with Yoav on the value of these memoirs, but I would not stay away from the archival sources that are available in the Arab world itself. It's certainly hard in the case of Egypt to get access to the state archive. Some people have gotten some material, but certainly there's a huge amount of material available in Beirut, the Institute for Palestine Studies. There's several archives now in the Lebanese Civil War. There's also an enormous repository of material in the Israel State Archives. For those of you who don't read Hebrew, there's still a lot of English material that you can access, and the declassification policy there, until its recent digitization efforts, is actually more generous in many ways than what you can get in American archives. So there is definitely a way in which we can substantiate these perspectives from the region as well.
Okay, thank you for your comments and questions. On your point about the fact that in some cases the Reagan administration was seen as reactive or didn't really understand, and instead in the Southern African case, it looks like a successful case. I have to clarify some points. First of all, of course, I brutally oversimplified the conflict in Southern Africa in my presentation, because I have a flight at 7 o'clock, so I cannot go too much into detail. But this conflict was much more complicated. Many other actors and factors were involved in the success, let's say this, of this story. But particularly, I didn't mention at all the important and crucial role of South Africa and Cuba, which were much more independent actors in the war. I focused, of course, only on the American side, because we are in a conference on Reagan. In my presentation, I probably never mentioned Ronald Reagan himself. I mentioned the Reagan administration, because as far as Southern Africa is concerned, I think that the biggest role was played by the mid-level officials, particularly in this case, Chester Croker. And in this case, I think the role of personality is really important. Chester Croker's personality and Chester Croker policy was really crucial in this context, because he truly understood, as I said in my presentation, the linkages among all the factors, all the levels of the conflicts. He was highly criticized for his policy, because basically his strategy was based on linking the problem of the Namibian independence to the withdrawal of the Cuban troops from Angola. So he said the two things must happen together. So he was highly criticized for subordinating the legitimate aspiration of the Namibian people to independence to what was an American interest, the withdrawal of the Cuban troops from Angola. But when I interviewed him, he told me, I didn't create this linkage. This linkage was there. I just acknowledged it, and I tried to create a strategy according to the fact on the ground, which maybe wasn't nice, but that was the reality. And I think it was right in this sense. On your point on Latin America, I didn't find any connection in the documents specifically saying, oh, look, we could try what we did in South Africa with Latin America. I found some connections to with Afghanistan. I can quote, I mean, after the Geneva Accord in April 1998, which established the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan, Chester Croker pushed a lot for putting the discussion on Southern Africa in agenda in the Soviet American meetings. And he said, we had developed a framework with the Soviets to talk about all the regional conflicts. They were not all of the same importance. The high ranking was, of course, Afghanistan. In terms of US domestic politics, I think the second most important probably was Central America. But in terms of the broader geopolitical framework, I would argue that it was Southern Africa. So just to give you. On Ori's point about the nuclear issue, indeed, when I mentioned the clash, the possible clash between South Africa and Cuba in 1987, 1988 on the Namibian border, both the superpowers were aware that South Africa had a secret nuclear program at the time, and this made this possible clash even more scary. When I interviewed Chester Croker about this point, he told me, yes, we knew, but we didn't really, it was not our principal concern. We were more concerned with the conventional forces on the ground, particularly with the possibility that the Cubans could cross the Namibian border, invading the South African territory. So that's the answer. Thank you.
Is this on? Is it working? No, doesn't sound like it.
Do you want to use mine?
Yep. Okay, so on your question about was the U.S. concerned about the threat Iraq posed to Kuwait, this wasn't really very new. Prior to the revolution in 1958, Nuri al-Said had brought up the question of taking over Kuwait whenever he felt like banging them over the head. In 1961, the Qasem regime threatened Kuwait again, and then which led to Operation Vantage, where the British came in to save the day. And then in 1973, the Ba'athist regime, of which Saddam Hussein was basically the strongman and the de facto leader, again, they kind of shelled Kuwait and tried to antagonize things there. So during the Iran-Iraq War, though, things completely changed. Instead of Kuwait being something that the Iraqis would kind of push around, Kuwait was suddenly bankrolling the Iraqis who were doing all the fighting. The Iranian Revolution, of course, upended their entire kind of dynamic of the region, and suddenly Iran was the threat and not Iraq. So when you ask about were they concerned, not at this stage, not during the Iran-Iraq War. It was after the war when Iraq refused to kind of demobilize its million-man army, and Kuwait was staring at this across their small little border, that it became an issue again. Now, fortunately for me, unlike a lot of other topics that people study on the region, we've got the captured Iraqi papers and transcripts of Saddam's conversations, because much like Nixon, he recorded every meeting. So that's an amazing resource for the study of the bilateral relation as opposed to just US policy towards Iraq. And on my next big project on the history of US-Iraq relations, I'm going to be taking those into consideration. Now finally, on the question of Haig and his hopes about Saddam Hussein, or his views towards Saddam Hussein, I don't have anything specific on him at this point, but I know that the State Department was not so sanguine about Saddam. They knew he was a nasty guy, and they knew what he was capable of doing, but at that stage in time, Iran was 100% their concern. They were willing to work with Saddam so long as he could actually stay in power, because they feared that if he fell, then you would get potentially an Ayatollah-type regime, because Iraq is majority Shia. So they wanted him to stay in power so long as the war was going on because they were afraid of what the alternative would be. Doug? Oh. Pass the mic.
That's right. Just a couple of quick questions in response to Yoav's comments. First, with regard to expertise that the U.S. had or didn't have with regard to the Middle East and the Arab world in particular, I think you're right. Much of the expertise was filtered through pro-Israel groups in the United States. One of the interesting things I found when I read Raymond Tanter's memoir called Rogue States, he was a NSC staffer in the early 1980s. He makes the comment, and I haven't seen it corroborated, and Will may know the answer, that Richard Allen, when he looked for Middle Eastern expertise on the NSC staff, turned to AIPAC, and he didn't quite have AIPAC vet the people, but it's not that Tanter implies that there was sort of a litmus test almost. A second thing, one of the commenters earlier this morning talked about the tragic bombing at the Beirut embassy in 1983. It basically wiped out the CIA's capacity to understand what was going on in the Palestinian world. Robert Ames, if you haven't read Kai Bird's book, The Good Spy, that is a spectacularly good book. And Ames was, I think it's probably fair to say, he was sympathetic to the Palestinians. He was actually pro-PLO. He was trying to broker the kind of conversations that Seth was suggesting might have happened in the late 70s. He was killed. So then at the end of the Reagan administration, a couple things happened. I think Schultz brings some people into the State Department who were a little more, from Schultz's standpoint, even-handed. But still, even as late as 1986, when the disco bombing takes place in West Berlin, there's this debate among the U.S. intelligence people whether the West Germans have got it right, and the West Germans think it was Hezbollah, or whether Mossad has got it right, and Mossad thinks it was Gaddafi. So yes, I think that's a key challenge for American policymakers, how to get the expertise, and as you suggest, it's more than just language. So there's that. And then second, on the Muslim world, it's Doug Little's shorthand for trying to get to talk about whatever he wants to talk about where there's Islam. Although I do think that until the late 80s or the early 90s, the State Department was organized sort of NEA in South Asia. So there was sort of and I think that's probably the way the State Department experts viewed the region. But you're quite right. The Muslim world is a very diverse place, and I'm sure there's more that they disagree on than what to eat for lunch. So point well taken.
Right, we take a few more questions, please.
We'll need to wrap up pretty quick.
All right, we'll take two more questions.
Yeah, another panel. We're very kind. I'm Dan White. I live here in Austin. And one thing that was mentioned here briefly but not worked on, one thing that was mentioned but did not go into any detail on by any panelist was the Jonathan Pollard espionage and how Yitzhak Shamir later on gave PSYOP more to the Russians. The question always was whether or not it was quid pro quo for increased Russian immigration to Israel, or Hirsch says it's just Shamir showing off. At what point did the Reagan administration find out that PSYOP 4 had been leaked by the Israelis to the Russians, and did the Israelis also leak the other key piece of information that Pollard had about sources and methods of intelligence collection? Ed Royman might possibly know the answer on that.
I've got a question for Doug and for Seth. My name's Olivia Stones, University of Central Florida. With Doug, I was interested in the Lebanese Civil War and whether Reagan, if you ever came across documents where he actually was personally kind of anguished about some of the events that transpired during the war, some of the massacres, not just Sabra and Shatila, but some of the larger collateral damage that was incurred by some of the Israeli bombings of Lebanon, and whether Reagan ever had any sort of reaction on an emotional standpoint, despite his strong support for Israel. And then maybe the bombings in Lebanon of the Marine barracks and how that push and pull maybe pushed him back towards Israel, maybe hard again. Obviously there's bombings. But just if you could comment on his personal reaction, if there's any, to some of those events. And then to Seth, just the document by Eugene Rostow. Obviously Eugene Rostow was also active in the Johnson administration when UN Resolution 242 was passed. So I didn't know, it's very confusing and kind of murky, in terms of interpreting that resolution. and actual, underlying assumptions that even the Johnson administration had about what really was allowed in terms of Israel's settlement policy there. So I don't know if you could actually comment on the successor and whether the Bush administration accepted Eugene Rostow's interpretation of the resolution the same manner that Reagan seems to have. I know that's a little non-Reagan, but I just was curious.
A quick comment on Lebanon, although Seth is the expert. Yeah, the answer is yes. Reagan got into it with Begin twice, once in the flesh and once on the phone over the summer of 1982 about the scope of the Israeli operation. And Seth may remember who it was. One of Reagan's advisors said he had very seldom seen Reagan lose his temper, but he lost his temper on the phone with Begin in August of '82 because Begin was doing what Begin did so well, which was to dance around and not really commit to a ceasefire. And in the wake of losing his temper, Begin committed to the ceasefire. So yes, I think that Reagan was quite involved. But
Yeah, the actual quote in his diary, he says, I told him I was calling PM Begin immediately, and I did. I was angry. I told him it had to stop or our entire future relationship was endangered. I used the word Holocaust deliberately and said the symbol of his war was becoming a picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off. He told me he had ordered the bombing stopped. I asked about the artillery fire. He claimed the PLO had started that and Israeli forces had taken casualties. End of call. 20 minutes later, he called to tell me he'd ordered an end to the barrage and pled for our continued friendship. There's other really revealing moments with Reagan's personal anguish about the war. As to your question about the legal framework and Rostow's influence, the debates over 242 are cyclical, so some administrations interpret it generously, some administrations had interpreted it more narrowly, but Carter certainly was very clear, as I suggested. Tanter, who was the NSC advisor on the Middle East, came out with a vigorous defense based on Rostow. He's made it policy that the settlements are legal. The issue is properly a political question, not a legal question. There is no law that bars Jews from settling in the West Bank. No one should be excluded based simply on the account of nationality or religion. Now, this, as I said, went against some of the interpretations of Israeli jurists, but it also shaped the way in which settlement policy continued from that point on. As we know, Bush Sr. reversed back to the Carter position, and that was the incident of the loan guarantees. But there was a particular inscription of a new legal thinking under Reagan.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll stop here. That's a good point about the Camp David and what a disaster it is.